Right. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief introduction, and I'll talk about Chinese names, the practice of adopting English names, and then a little bit about the implications for the classroom. And if you want to have a stab at trying to practice Chinese names, give you a little bit of an introduction to that, and then I'm happy to discuss this. So it looks like you've all interacted with Chinese people at the adopt English names, very common practice.
Yep.
Okay. So I first became kind of, I was teaching in Taiwan, and I kind of got used to, a lot of Chinese people would introduce themselves with a quote-unquote English name. And the time that really drove it home for me was when I was teaching a kindergarten class, and had a group of 2- and 3-year-old children came in with boards around their necks with their English names, and that, just the idea of, how that was a cultural phenomenon really struck me. Then a few years ago, I was working in another university. I was in charge of the international students there, and 2 faculty members, 2 chairs came to talk to me because they had questions about the large influx of Chinese students. And the chair of the translation department said, I think it's terrible. We have all these Chinese students. They're coming in. They're taking English names. I think it's so disrespectful to them. I think it's just such an oppression on them to force them to change their names to adopt an English name. They should be proud of their Chinese name. Then the chair of the public relations department was listening, and he said, no, I don't agree with that. I think if they're here in the United States, they need to adopt an English name. If they're going to be successful, if they're going to be remembered, they need to kind of adjust. And those 2 very different positions really kind of triggered my interest in this, and that's why I started my research on this. So in mainland China, it, as a widespread phenomenon, it goes back to the 1980s. Outside of China, it's has an earlier practice, but as we'll see, there's a very good cultural reason for that. And as I point out, different views on this, and my next study that I hope to start is looking at how American faculty in particular view the adoption of Chinese of English names, what their positions are. My study was focused on the Chinese students in particular. So Americans will often look at it either as a case of adapting and kind of assimilation perhaps, or just working with something that is effective, or succumbing to linguistic imperialism, being forced and forcibly assimilated. Just a little bit background on socioonomastics, the practice of studying names.
Socioonomastics?
Socioonomastics, yes. Onomastic study of names, socio is within society. So taking Pierre Bourdieu's stance that language is directly relevant to economics, this idea of the unification of the market, that that economic capital is inextricably linked with cultural capital, social capital, linguistic capital, etc. I would argue that there's onomastic capital as well. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at how people react on the single variable of somebody's name. So people will send out a whole bunch of CVs or resumes applying for jobs and see what the differences are. This has a strong history in studying African American names. So African American names typically marked, much less likely to get called back for interviews, but similarly for Asian names, Muslim names, etc. And names linguistically are a tricky subject. The reason why it's hard to remember people's names is because there is only one person. So even if you know 10 people named Michael, each of those Michaels connects only to that individual. Whereas if you know 10 if you think of the word table, there are many tables. They don't connect to specific tables. So names are particularly hard. This is why we have trouble remembering names. And even in academia, there have been studies, faculty may be less likely to respond to this study, for example. They would send emails to faculty and say, I'm an international student, I'm on campus, I'd like to talk to you about possibly studying for a PhD. Unfortunately, there was significant data that showed that if you had a quote unquote white sounding English name, you were much more likely to get a response. All the way at the bottom were Chinese sounding names. So just to give you a background there on names. So a background then on Chinese names. Chinese names are family name plus a personal name, as is the case for English speakers typically. But family names are fewer and much older than in most of the world. So Chinese names go back over 2,000 years. Most European countries, family names go back 1,000 to 500 years, to give you an idea. And this is one of the reasons why there are so few Chinese names, why you see so many Lis and Chens and Wangs, for example. I think in China, a population of 1.3, 1.4 billion, there are about 800 names to account for that population. In the United States, population about 350 million, we have I think over 165,000 names, family names. So family names are much more diverse in pretty much every other country than they are compared to China. Personal names, on the other hand, are much more flexible. So while you may know 10 Michaels, Chinese names are much more likely to be unique because the idea of a name in English, for example, is very well fixed. So a name like Michael or Jennifer is identified as a name for English speakers. It's not a thing. Chinese doesn't really have that concept. Any word, any morpheme can be a name. And so this is why names can be much more unique. Family names, because they are so old, are virtually never changed. Chinese people typically have a very close affinity to their names. Women do not change their names when they marry, for example. It is very rare that under any circumstances a Chinese person will change their family name. Personal names, on the other hand, are far more flexible than they are in the English-speaking world. Chinese people have traditionally changed their personal names over the course of their lifetimes and in different contexts for many reasons. So entering a monastery, children will often take a school name, which is different from the family name that they're given. Business names are not uncommon. In fact, there are many cases where a successful business person may adopt 3 different names for each individual business they have. So they have one name for their printing business, another for their transport business, another for their import and export business. So this idea of having multiple names for different contexts is very much a Chinese cultural practice. This is the idea that we have one name and that we're born with it is a European idea perhaps, but there are many cultures where your name changes over the passage of your lifetime. So you'll have a name as a baby, a name as a toddler, name as a youth, etc. When you get married, when you have children, etc. So there are different names. This is, naming practices are universal. Every culture uses names. Every person has a name, but in some cultures you will change your names multiple times in your lifetime. So within the Chinese context, the idea of adopting an English name is not unusual. It's just very much within the Chinese cultural practice. And this partially explains why Chinese people are much more likely to adopt an English name than native Arabic speakers or Japanese speakers, for example. So because it's very much a part of the Chinese practice. Even in the US, primary official English names largely began in the 1940s, which was also a time when other ethnicities started having more regularized names. In Indonesia, it's type communal rest in the 1960s. Chinese people started to adopt English names to connect with the global community. But in mainland China, which is the focus of my study and what I'm primarily going to be talking about, it's very much tied up with the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, opening up to the world after Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. This practice became widespread. And so since the 1980s, it has become the dominant practice of the majority of those in contact with non-Chinese. That includes international students coming here, but it's also interesting to note that it is very common in China itself. So there are people who work in Chinese businesses who do not interact with non-Chinese speakers and who will still adopt an English name. Some places, the human resources departments in Chinese corporations require an English name on the application. So this is a very common practice in China itself now. So often the perception is that it's done because non-Chinese people may not be able to pronounce the Chinese name. This idea that we don't have the, we don't know Chinese, and there is some validity to this because it is a tonal language, as we'll see. But this is very much the perception. You won't be able to pronounce my Chinese name. But you know, there are plenty of other names that we will struggle with again, kind of working out how to pronounce that word. And yet, those people do not change their names. Names are sometimes assigned and sometimes chosen. So I gave you the example in Taiwan where every child at 2 or 3 years old was given a Chinese name, was given an English name. The teachers would say, okay, this is the name you're given. Sometimes the teachers will just go through a list in a dictionary or list of names, say, okay, that's your name. But other times Chinese people will adopt an English name. And sometimes they may change it multiple times. So that, you know, each time they go from one situation to another, they move from one university to another, they take a new name. Many Chinese people in China take names that would be kind of strange. So for English speakers. So names like Medusa or Satan, things like that. When they come to an English-speaking context, they may change that name again. They come from a lot of different backgrounds, so they may be translations from Chinese, jade and dragon, things like this. They are often phonologically similar. So Jenny may become Jenny, for example. Often they will go from a list of names, name books, etc. Some of them are aspirational names. One adopted the name CEO, for example. Sometimes they will name themselves after popular people, which is interesting. They may choose Michael because of Michael Jordan, or Rachel was very popular during Friends time, which is interesting because in China, you are almost, it is not really something where you would be named after somebody. You would not be named after the president. You would not be named after your father or your mother or your great-grandparents or anything like that. But for adopting English names, that's okay. So, or a combination of these factors. So some interesting choices there. So as I say, they are used in China when speaking Chinese to other people, but are very often used when speaking with non-Chinese people or outside of China. And part of the reason, part of the effect of this, I won't say the reason, part of the effect of this is that this can evade some of the cultural expectations in China about name and title usage. So in English discourse, typically we are much more likely to use names when we're talking to somebody, right? We say, oh, Rita, could you help me with this? In China, that's much less common to use somebody's name to address them, and you would address them by their title. Excuse me, Vice Provost, could you help me with this, right? So that would be much more typical in Chinese discourse. And so using the English, because when they learn English, they need to kind of work out, well, do I call my professor, instructor, and Leo, or Dr. Schmitt, or what do I use, right? Using the English name creates this kind of, okay, I don't have to work that out. an English name is just an English name. The Americans don't seem to care much about this. At the same time, it can kind of create a barrier for the individual. So they use their English name as a way to say, it's like, don't call me by the name that's on the roster. Don't call me by my given name, because typically those names are very personal. Those names are used by the person's family or their close friends. They are not used by employees, strangers, teachers, etc. Teachers much more often may use family names.
Did I read somewhere that also it's typically if, say, there's a monosyllable for the surname, family name, and monosyllable for the first name, that say, like, who's the woman who teaches Chinese? Lei Ping. And I'm always uncomfortable calling her Lei, because that doesn't feel right. I say Lei Ping.
Right, yeah, so.
And I imagine it should actually be Ping Lei.
Yeah, Ping Lei, right, or even Ping Jiao Shou, right, Professor Ping, right, so it's like, so within Chinese discourse, the way that you typically use, using an individual's monosyllabic first name, very much a family kind of thing. So using an English name avoids a lot of those issues, that cultural, it's like, somebody's calling me the same name that my mother calls me when she's feeling cute, right? So what does all this mean for teaching? First off, we've got this issue of defensiveness. Unfortunately, there's a larger picture of xenophobia, including towards Chinese individuals. 2-3 years ago, there was an unfortunate incident just up here at Columbia dorms where Chinese names were defaced. Chloe Bennett Wong, who's a famous actress, has spoken out about how she dropped Wang as her family name, because her father is Chinese, I believe, from China, not ethnically Chinese, but ethnically Chinese as well. But she dropped that because she felt that the racism in Hollywood was such that she could not be acknowledged. So this larger issue creates a defensiveness on the part of our students. All of our students, of course, may come with a sense of vulnerability, right? You come into the classroom, first time in more if you're, the new school, it's a big fancy university in a big scary city. That can put students on the defensive. How do I behave? How do I belong? And name choices may reflect that. As I say, an English name for Chinese students can kind of create this barrier, this distance. And so clearly we want to kind of create a cohesive and supportive classroom. It's, one of the things I found with talking with so many Chinese students was the expectations that so many of our students come with. They really hope that they're going to make friends with American students, people from all over the world.
I think somebody's just joined online.
Okay, cool. Right, so yeah, they really hope that they're going to be able to make connections, and that's often not the case. One study found that of all international students, 50% come to the United States and leave the United States never having made a single American friend. And from my studies indicate that this is more of a problem for Chinese. Chinese students often have a significant problem kind of making connections with them, particularly with American students, but more generally non-Chinese. Sure, go ahead. Yeah, no problem.
Could we ask the people who have joined online to please mute your audio? And we didn't realize that screen sharing is on, so we're about to share the screen, so you'll be able to see the slides.
I said we had it for a split second when she started on the
That's fine by me.
You can also mute the participants. Oh, yeah.
Video.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so the more that we can do to kind of make our students welcome, of course, there are, you know, some major benefits for that in terms of reducing the defensiveness of our students. Okay, thank you. Okay, so cultural sensitivity. Anytime that I talk about culture, I really think it's important that we preface that with two, I hope, incontrovertible facts. First off, we're all the same. We're all human beings. We all have the same biological and psychological drives, you know, the same issues, the same challenges as human beings. And we are all different. We are all individuals. Each one of us brings our own strengths and weaknesses to the table. We are not defined by our culture, by our background, by our upbringing. Those are not the only things that are here. But having said that, we can look at, you know, what are significant parts of being a member of a group. So when we're looking at our Chinese students, we can talk about broad generalizations, but we need to be aware at all times of these first two principles, that we're all human beings and we're all individuals. So you know, our Chinese students are each individuals, they're different. So everything that I'm saying here needs to be looked at with that, within that context. So bear in mind that things differ, okay? So conceptualizations of naming will vary. Different students will take different views on this. And this is certainly something that came out in my research, looking at how people feel about their names, some significant differences. And remember that this is also indicative of other issues to do with our students. They're all going to be different. They're going to bring different strengths and weaknesses to the table. Then respect for student choice, right? So, you know, the new school recognizes our members, community members' right to choose their preferred name. They can put that on their ID name if they want. So your students may ask to be addressed by an English name. When I first came back from Taiwan, I taught at Queen's College, and I had a lot of Chinese students, and I felt very proud of myself because I knew Chinese and I could pronounce their names, and I kind of insisted on using their Chinese names. Because it made me feel good, perhaps. And so, you know, but in retrospect, I realized that that was kind of an invasive position from me, that some of them really did not feel comfortable, that they wanted to use their English name. Others, on the other hand, prefer to use their Chinese name. And so being aware of your students' preferences, I think, is important. Engaging with them, understanding. Within that context, of course, we need to recognize that Chinese educational culture, by and large, is very top-down. The idea is that the student conforms to the teacher's wishes, so we need to be careful about that. As, you know, are we imposing our views? We do, you know, the new school, I think, rightly encourages autonomy and empowerment, you know, that our students take control of their lives. Bear in mind, of course, that that's also an American ideal, so that opens up some questions about to what extent are we imposing other ideas, right? So let's engage with some Chinese names. And as I say, many Chinese students want to use their English names. In the past 5 years, there does seem to be an increasing trend towards Chinese people using their Chinese names. So you will probably find more and more of your students are saying, please use my Chinese name. Talk about that later if you're interested in my hypothesis on that. But as I say, names can be virtually any Chinese morpheme. There are over 50,000 characters in Chinese. It's reading and writing very complicated. Chinese is the only widespread use of a logographic system where each symbol represents a word. Now, all four of these, mom, hemp, horse, and scold, are pronounced ma. Okay? But they're not all pronounced ma because it's tonal. So, is mom, ma is hemp, ma is horse, and ma is scold. So when I learned Chinese, it took me about 6 months for those to kind of start to feel right. It's a long process. So depending on the tone, can have a very different meaning. And this is part of the reason why some students may not feel comfortable with you engaging with their Chinese name, because they feel, well, you're going to mess it up, and if you use the wrong tone, could be implications. Sometimes not. Many of the students that I talked to really didn't have a problem. They say, okay, that's okay, you're not a Chinese speaker, I understand. So there's a lot of flexibility for you as a non-native Chinese speaker to engage with the name, but some students prefer you don't. Some students like it, and so this is also part of the dialogue. So there are multiple Chinese dialects. Mandarin or Standard Chinese is the most widespread. It's the official language of mainland China, People's Republic of China, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, as well as a dual official language now, I think, in Hong Kong and the language that's taught in schools in Singapore. So Mandarin is pushing out the other dialects. There are multiple ways of transcribing these logographs, because these logographs, these Chinese characters, can be pronounced in different ways in different dialects. So all Chinese dialects, although they are not mutually intelligible, okay, a Cantonese speaker cannot understand a Mandarin speaker if they have not studied Mandarin. They can write the same system. This is one of the benefits of this system. So how we transcribe it, there are different ways. All of these are Mandarin. So 新年快乐, 新年快乐, 新年快乐. Those are 3 different ways of transcribing it. This one, Hanyu Pinyin, is by far the most common. This is the official one adopted by the Chinese government. And you will see this for all your students from mainland China.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is the Shinwen, I don't know how to say it, but is that
新年快乐, that's Happy,
Happy
New
New
Year.
Year.
Happy New Year?
Happy New Year.
Okay.
Okay. So many letters in Pinyin correspond to English pronunciation, okay, but it's also the one that you'll see all these X's and Q's and Z's and kind of look at those names and say, okay, well, how do I pronounce those? So the X is kind of a sh sound. It's a little different, actually, and the Q is a little different. It's close to a ch sound, and the Z is a z sound. Vowels may change their quality a little, and typically one of the big challenges is that the tones are not written in romanization. So when you see a name on the roster, for example, and you see the name is Mei Lin, you don't know, is it Mei Lin or Mei Lin or Mei Lin, or which one, right? So that, again, you have to kind of engage with the student to kind of get a sense of what, what the tone is for their names. So this is a really cool website here. And as you can see, here we've got all the consonants and all the vowels. And so this is all of the possible syllable combinations in Chinese. If you can pronounce these, you can pronounce every single syllable in Chinese. Chinese has a much more restricted phonology than English does.
We're just going to switch the screen so that the people online can see this.
Okay, they may not be able to see this, sure. I think this one here.
Yep.
Okay. And so if you find your student's name and you see their name is Meng here, you can click on it and you can hear it in the first tone, second tone, third tone, and fourth tone. So. So anyone, you're kind of working out that ZH sound, for example, and you see this one here. You see. So the ZH is a j sound, kind of like in treasure or in garage, depending how pronounced garage. But in English, we don't use that sound at the beginning of a syllable. In Chinese, you can, obviously, right? So zhe, so it's zuo, And then the tones here, these 4 tones, the first tone is a high tone. So it's said high and flat. So like zuo, zuo, zuo. So it's at the higher end of your register and flat. The second one is a rising tone, kind of like a question. So you say zuo, zuo, zuo. The third one goes down and up. So go zuo, zuo, zuo. And then the fourth one is a falling tone, kind of like you're angry, I guess you could say, zuo, zuo, zuo. Okay? So, I mean, as I say, this is a process. If you want to engage with your Chinese students' names, you can get an idea of how you can pronounce the words there. Then you have to work out what the tones are, because as I say, most of the time, are written down. You don't know how exactly to do that, right? So, and I think, Rita, you're going to share these slides, right?
Yes, we will share the slides.
Yeah, so you'll have the link there. Oh, I'll put the share screen. Switch it back. Okay. So, this is still pretty widespread. I'd be interested to hearing from you all as your kind of feel on the Chinese students that you're working with. As I say, it's a widespread practice. I suspect it's peaked. I suspect that more and more Chinese people are sticking with their Chinese names here in the United States. But hopefully, with a bit of understanding that you've got from here today, you have better pedagogical resources, but also on a grander scale, we can hope for good things, right? So I think it's important to respect your students' wishes, but also explore those wishes. What's behind them? What can you do to make them feel comfortable in the classroom? So with that, have any questions, comments? What are your feelings? Love to hear. What are your sense? Do you find half your students use a Chinese name, half don't, or are you finding the majority do one or the other?
I'm finding more using their Chinese names than used to in previous years.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of been my sense.
So, and what's your theory, Leah?
So I'm suspecting, because this is such a, as I said earlier, the practice is that that using an English name is not a big deal for Chinese speakers. I suspect that Chinese people are adopting an English or American perspective on names. This idea that you have your name is the name that your family gave you, and this is the name that you keep throughout your life, this is the name you use in all situations. And so they're actually, paradoxically, perhaps, using their Chinese name because they are becoming more American. They're adapting to American culture and say, okay, in American culture, you use your Chinese name. There was an interesting newspaper article a while back about a Chinese American who grew up in the United States and was fiercely proud of the Chinese name that he had in the United States. And he went back to China, or to his parents' country, and got a job there. And they said, well, what's your English name? I have an English name. He fought his whole life to keep his Chinese name. And there in China, they were telling him, no, you have to have an English name. And that was, this idea of, English name is very common in China. So I suspect it's more common now to adopt a Chinese name here in China, in the United States, than it is in China.
Can you talk maybe a little bit about ways, I mean, the website is fantastic for hearing what it might sound like. I hear very often faculty, not merely Chinese names, but Slavic names and African names. And faculty, this surprises me as someone with a name who frequently gets tortured, that many faculty are resistant to learning how to pronounce names. And it seems to me like we have so many resources to be able to have them actually record it. You could take a picture of them with their recording and actually learn their names that way. I don't know if you have any suggestions.
Sure. So, I mean, this kind of plays into some of my research on the broader level about the impact of monolingualism. So we have a joke in my field that, what do you call somebody who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual, right? Somebody who speaks 3 languages, trilingual. Somebody who speaks 1 language, American. So, or English, or Australian, or because English kind of forces us or doesn't force us, but encourages us to remain monolinguals, to be reluctant to engage with other languages. So our international students come here, they are, doing everything that our American students are doing, but in another language, which is an enormous challenge, of course. But because English is such a politically, scientifically, diplomatically, economically powerful language, it's been called the hypercentral language of our era. Because of that, if you grow up speaking English as your first language, the incentives to learn another language are reduced significantly. Whereas the incentives to learn English, if English is not your first language, are huge. And so this is one of the challenges for, for those of us who did grow up speaking English as our first language. It's like we are used to the world working for us. It's our language privilege. And so I think one of the first things is to be aware of that, to be aware of how blessed we are, how privileged we are to have English as our first language. And then from there, we kind of say, okay, let's take a little bit of compassion for those who don't, kind of engage with that and say, yes, I'm willing to engage with somebody else's name. Because, say, well, it's like, accommodate to me because I've got the power, because my language is the power. And I think that mindset is, I'm not criticizing anybody for having that mindset, because if you grow up in an English-speaking community, it's what is normalized, right? But getting people to be aware that, yeah, there's a whole world out there that doesn't speak English, that have different names, that have names that have sounds that are not familiar for English speakers, that have consonant clusters that we're not familiar with. It's engaging with them. So I think that's an important part. Another important part, I think, is engaging with the students. Different students respond to this differently. So virtually all of the Chinese students that I spoke to during my project said, no, I have no problem if non-Chinese people mispronounce my name, if they butcher my name, if they try, it's okay. I'm fine with using my English name, but I don't have a problem. So part of this is also culturally bound. So some people are much more defensive about their names. So, and again, this goes to the dialogue with our students. Are our students going to feel very bad? Most of our students typically are willing to put up with that. And again, it goes back to this dialogue. How much are you as the instructor willing to kind of engage with them and say, listen, I really want to get your name right. Please help me with this. And other students say, that's okay, you just pronounce my name that way and it's fine. And that's a dialogue that you go on, hopefully throughout the semester or throughout your time working with that student, kind of get it better. As with everything else, right? You're working out, okay, what do you expect in the classroom? What is appropriate behavior? All of these other questions. We're engaging in this dialogue. Have to entertain other questions.
I find often I get into the situation where I'm taking role and I'm not good at pronouncing English names. Like I get the vowels wrong all the time. Like is it Alana or Elena?
Right.
Or,
yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And I think I do this thing where I sometimes embarrass the students by kind of drawing too much attention to me and my butchering of their name and trying to figure out how to say it.
Right.
And I think ideally I would take them aside at some point and have the conversation one-on-one, but there often isn't kind of time or space for that.
Yeah.
Like, what are your thoughts on, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think, I mean, I guess
Right.
students would react to that in different ways depending on who they are.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. One of the things I do is the first day of class, first week of class, because you know, people add and drop. But the first day of class, I'm calling register. I say, if you have a preferred name, or if I mispronounce your name, please let me know. And some students feel very comfortable with that and say, you know, no, please call me this. Other students may not. And so one of the things I also do is say, if you'd rather talk to me afterwards about a preferred name, that's fine as well, right? So, I mean, so encouraging them to engage, I think is the first step. At some point, you know, I think instructors, we have a responsibility towards our students, but they also have a responsibility. And at a certain point, if they're not willing to advocate for themselves, you know, we want to give them the opportunity to advocate for themselves, to share their names. But you know, there's a limit to how far you can go. If they just, you know, clam up and say, let's talk about my name at all, you know, move on. And there are other things you need to deal with as a teacher. Right? So yeah, I think giving them the space and the opportunity and say, come talk to me after, you know, calling roll, say if you have a preferred name, if I mispronounce your name, I apologize, and let me know how I pronounce it. I think those are all good practices. But we're dealing with, you know, hundreds of other things in the classroom too, right? So giving them the space and saying, okay, here's the space. I really want you to engage with me and share your name. And if it's important to you, I'll work hard on it. But if they're not taking advantage of that, you know, I think names play a role, but they're not the only thing going on. Right?
Those of you who are joining online, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
Could I ask a question? In addition to inviting them to help you learn to pronounce their name,
Right.
Does anyone, or yourself included, does anyone have any strategies for those sort of, as you're learning their names, and it sometimes takes me 2 or 3 sessions, especially if it's a seminar class, for quick activities or games or any kind of strategies that get them to learn each other's names and help you to learn their names?
You're reminding me of when I taught freshman composition, and I would do this thing where each one, so you would say your name, and then you would say her name and your name, and then you would say her name and her name and your name. And by the time it got to me at the end, and I would have to do everybody, but I knew everybody's names, and they knew because there was such a repetition of it. They all knew each other's names.
I think I have done what I think is a simpler one, a sort of rhythmic game, because I work with musicians, where we do some kind of clapping and say our name, and then the next person would say the next name, and then we get to 5, and then we put all 5 together, and then we do the next 5, and then we put all 10 together, so that you go around a few times and you get them. But yours is maybe more immediate, that you go from one, the second person does both, the third person does all 3. So by the time you get it, you've heard it
25 times.
Yeah, it's great.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a good strategy. I think, you know, as I say, I kind of situate it with, you know, allowing students to voice their own name, right? Whatever their preferred name is. Now, what I will put a caveat here. One of the challenges I found when I started, you know, I had Chinese students and they'd have an English name, and you know, I've got my roster here has all the Chinese names, and this one's saying I'm Mike and I'm Jenny and I'm like, okay, well, who are you on the roster, right? And so when you're doing something like Rita's, exercise, which I think is great, you know, encourage them to choose the name that they want to be known by, right? That they want to be identified by, and that makes them much more comfortable in this process. But it does complicate things a little bit when you're trying to work out, well, I've got, you know, 12 students here, Chinese students here, and I didn't hear a single Chinese name. And it's like, okay, I can remember you're Rachel and you're Jennifer and you're Marie or whatever it is. And you're trying to, okay, well, that makes it, you're still going to have a process of linking that English name up to the Chinese name or other names. I mean, you know, we have transgender students, for example. We have students from other countries who may choose a different name. than is on the roster. So those are all things to be aware of.
I also do something with file cards.
Mhm.
I make name tents so that we can learn each other's names, so we can
Okay.
address each other. But I've learned this by experience. I have them put the name they want to be called on the outside, but on the back side, for me, I want their last name, what school they come. I want the pertinent information, and then I take attendance that first day from those cards.
Okay, that sounds like a great exercise.
I just have a request. I don't know if this is even possible, but I believe other schools have this sort of system. So I know we got photo rosters, but it would be amazing if we could let our students say their
Audio.
name and have an audio clip of it, instead of recording them individually and singling them out. If every student could do that, and they can even say their pronouns as well, that would be really cool. Yeah, just
That may be
throwing
something.
that out there.
Yeah,
There's
I
a
think-
company called Name Coach that actually allows for that. It's primarily, and it was designed originally to help people like what I used to do when I was at Lang at commencement, when you had to read everybody's name and
Yeah.
want to get it correct. And then they've expanded it now for rosters and stuff. We explored it a little bit, but it's $10,000
Oh my goodness.
a year. I think so. Yeah.
The other thing I think, to build on Anne's suggestion, maybe on Canvas, everybody's got their profile. Maybe we can look at something that we could have just everybody pronouncing their name. So you click on their name. A lot of students don't put anything up on their profile, but if we kind of did that at a larger level, we could have everybody pronouncing their name and their preferred pronouns and other pertinent information. Good idea. All right.
I have one other question. I heard you say that you ask your students for their preferred name. Is that like I'm very conscious of what preferred or the language that I use in that context, if I should just say the name that you would like to be called,
Yes.
or
Right.
or a
Yes.
preferred name,
Yeah.
or
No. So if I wearing my hat, we've moved away from saying preferred pronoun. What are your pronouns? What name do you want? What name should we call you? Or something like that, as opposed to preferred name. Because in some cases, it's actually not a preference. In some cases, it is a preference. Yes, this is my name, but I like to be called Lily.
The other thing, I taught ESL for many years, and so working with international students, one of the practices that I got into is just paraphrasing everything I say. So if I say, if you have a preferred name you'd like me to call you, so if there's so I'll say it one, two, or three different ways, and so you get, sometimes, particularly if they're non-native speakers, they may struggle to pick out, wait a minute, what's that, preferred name, right? So yeah, the name you want me to call you, the name you want me to use. So I'll say things, in different manners.
It's actually a really good teaching tip.
Yes.
Yeah.
Paraphrase
Yeah.
yourself.
Paraphrase, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, every time I catch myself using a more advanced word, okay, or cultural references too. Howdy doody references. Circle back to make sure my non-native speakers and non-American speaking students understand.
Or of a certain generation.
Or a certain generation, exactly, yes. So yeah, one of those.
Any last questions or comments?
Okay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Leo.
This is helpful. Thank you.
I was really hoping that NYT was New York Times. We had a participant online in my team.
Yeah. how can we access it? Like, are you recorded it? Or are you posting the video, or can we access the slides?
We did record it.